I welcome everyone into this platform. My name is Akuila Sovanivalu. I'm a human rights officer with the United Nations Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, Pacific Regional Office here in Suva, Fiji. I have also a wonderful task this morning to acknowledge our panelists who have joined us this morning, putting aside their busy schedule and be able to come in to share their knowledge, their experience, their story to us on our topic on clean energy and sustainable transport. We have this morning with us Moñeka from the Micronesian Climate Alliance. We also have Reverend James Bhagwan from the Pacific Conference of Churches, and Eva Nancy Vunikura from Drua Experience, and Taholo from the KamiPasifika solution. Just before we allow the time for our panelists to have a deep dive and discuss on this area of clean energy and sustainable transport, just setting the scene, the Pacific Island leaders demand a fossil-free future, thus a transition to more climate-friendly form of energy. Despite being an eligible emitter of greenhouse gases, the Pacific region continues to bear the brunt of the ever-increasing threat of natural hazards exacerbated by the fossil fuel industry. Well, this session will draw on new existing approaches and strategies towards clean energy and transport practices in the Pacific, and recognizing the necessity of youth accomplishment in ensuring longevity and sustainability of practices. To the panelists and also to the participants, there are three main key questions that the panelists will tend to answer and also present. As I mentioned, it's a Talanos session. It's a storytelling in a more Pacific way, and then we'll try to get constructive outcomes from this Talanos session. The questions are: can renewable energy replace fossil fuels? How can private organization in the Pacific help country government achieve this target? That's the first question. The second question: what can we do at community level to help support a more just transition to clean energy and transport? The last question that they will be deliberating on is: how are you or your organization actively ensuring youth accomplishment, mentoring in your area of work? Now, before I invite the first speaker, our first speaker is Moñeka. Moñeka is an indigenous Chamorro mother, climate peace activist, educator, and dedicated community organizer based in the Mariana Islands. She is currently a just transition curriculum and a policy fellow with the Climate Justice Alliance, where she co-coordinates community-based solution with member organization Micronesia Climate Change Alliance. She is deeply involved in efforts to uplift the experience of Pacific Islanders on the front lines of climate crisis. She received a BA in anthropology in 2011 and a Micronesian Studies graduate program certificate in 2019, both from the British University of Guam. Dioro has wide professional and volunteer experience in social justice, historical preservation, environment protection, and cultural persuasion. So she is also a director of board for Guam Environmental Protection, and also was selected as a U.S. Department of Youth leader in 2019, and also her involvement with the alumni. With that depth of experience, with that depth of knowledge, I now hand over the floor to Monica Deoro for her to discuss the elements of clean energy and transport. Over to you.
Hafide, thank you so much for that warm welcome. And that was a little stressful trying to get in and trying to be able to ensure that I can contribute to this really important conversation around how the Pacific and the rest of the world really needs to be moving to adopt energy that is really clean and not just quote unquote, air quotes, clean. And how we also need to be developing strategies for transportation across our beautiful ocean that is also regenerative and also in harmony and mindful of the ocean and the impacts on the ocean, just like our ancestors have always done. So I'd like to open. I'm going to see if I could share my screen. Yes. Are you able to see that? So, again, Guahusi Moñeka Dioro Ginini Islas Marianas, Kagizuki Islan Saipampagu Lo. I call all of the Marianas home, and the Marianas, if you could see on this map, is in the northern Pacific, and we are U.S. territories, both Guam and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. I call both of these lands my homelands. As a Chamorro woman, my people have been here for over 4,000 years, and we were one of the first groups to leave Asia, and we're one of the oldest cultures in all of the Pacific and remote Oceania. It's an honor to be here representing not only Guahan and the Marianas, but also the rest of Micronesia in this important discussion and this important gathering for us leading up to COP26. So Hafide, Tiro, Rana Nim, Ali, Casalelia, Yokwe, and all the other greetings from Micronesia. Thank you so much for having me. I'd like to open with a chant. I thought it was really appropriate, a short chant around for navigators, as we all here in the Pacific hail from great lineages of Pacific navigators, honoring their spirit, honoring their wisdom of the navigators and the sort of value system that they had, and understanding the waves, the stars, the wind, the sea, and all the sea creatures is still something that can really help guide us as we navigate these precarious and changing times. So this chant is a Chamorro chant written by Leonard Iriarte of the group Ifan Lalayan, and it's a blessing before a journey. And I hope to bring us all on this canoe together with this chant. It's called Tumotiki Lahi. Ginin lagu naman matu hugi zaina fulu nalazak man momognu itamun gitasi fanenga isagwa haganya fanenga imagaga Fanenga zan fange kunguk kunguki kating kulu Satmahan et nun iman yahaina Samahan et noni mahanya haina Tumotsugi lahi matenguma. This is a small scene. In that chant is also a realization that of the role of women, and for a navigator, they really do take into consideration the request and the advice of women. And in this time, I think it's also really important that Indigenous women across the world take the lead in instituting and implementing and designing climate solutions. It is the women who are at the intersection of all the different oppressions associated with climate change, and it truly is the women's work to ensure that all people, especially our children and future generations and our lands, are taken care of and are left in a condition that is better than what we found it. I'm trying to share my screen, but it doesn't seem to be working, and that's okay. But I had some beautiful images to share from Micronesia, especially from my homelands and of my own child. Um, Learning about traditional navigation, Micronesia has been so lucky in that colonization of some of our brothers and sister islands in the Federated States of Micronesia, like Satawal, Pulawat, Ifaluk. They've all been able to maintain and hold on to their traditional navigation that has enabled them to live and thrive in their islands for thousands of years. And I've been lucky enough to work with Papa Mao's son, Antonio Pialog, here in Saipan and in Guam, to reclaim our seafaring heritage here in the Marianas, as he is so generous in the ways that his father was in sharing his information with the Polynesian Voyage Society and all those who went on the Hokulea, which has now been around the world so much. And we owe so much to the people of Micronesia and for their wisdom, for their generosity, and for their foresight in ensuring that this knowledge, this sacred knowledge, is passed on to others, and that the whole of the Pacific and the rest of the world really comes to know the wonder and magic that is traditional navigation. Um, my there's so many efforts here on Guam, many and in the Marianas, many different organizations that are doing the heavy lift to uplift this cultural work, to come to it with the practice of really honoring ancestors and also innovating in the uses of materials that we have to create our canoes. 500 Sails is an organization headquartered here in the island of Saipan, and they have 7 canoes, or 5 canoes at the moment, 2 more being built shortly, that are in the style of traditional Chamorro Sacmans, which have been lost over the past few centuries because of Spanish colonization early on. And now we've been able to reclaim and rebuild some boats based on archival records, and also using modern sailing and building techniques with fiberglass that have been taught from organizations to the people of the Marianas in New Zealand. In 2018, I was also lucky enough to be a part of of the maiden voyage between the Marianas of the island of Rota to Guam on an Okeanos vessel, which is also found throughout the Pacific, the Okeanos Marianas, which was here just for a short while. But I was able to experience that beautiful voyage and feel my ancestors present as I was out on the open ocean between the islands of Rota and Guahan. And it was such a transformational experience for me. And I really, truly hope that all kids throughout the Pacific get to have that experience of open ocean voyaging and of traveling the way our ancestors did. And out here in the Pacific, it's really important that we invest our time, energy, resources in these sorts of transportation solutions and in these cultural traditions, because they protect resources, they ensure that our communities are connected to our cultures, and also they help to curb carbon emissions. These, even though it's a slower way of travel and there's some conditions in which that it's not safe to do so, and some times of year where it's not really, because it's bound by the wind, it's not really available. It just means that we have to shift our sense of time and sense of urgency of moving things around. we were so lucky to have the Okeanos here after a super typhoon that hit the island of Tinian and Saipan, Typhoon Yutu in October of 2018, which devastated so many of my family members and relatives up here, as it was the biggest storm ever recorded, really, in the 21st century, with sustained winds of up to 200 miles per hour. And so that vessel was able to have a low carbon footprint, delivering supplies and humanitarian aid between the different islands that needed that sort of support after such an event like a typhoon. And one big thing about all the things that come through our islands with the modern transportation is that all these shipping goods, all this food that's brought in really creates a lot of waste for us, and really creates a diet that is not necessarily the best for our bodies. Here in my home island of Guahan, we import 90% of our foods. And that is a scary thought, given that the world is in such a precarious environmental state. And if things were to happen and we were to be cut off from shipping lines and from air free, and this was something that we were very cognizant of at the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic, what are we going to do to ensure that our island is fed if we rely on 90% of the food being brought in by ships and by planes? So having that deep thought, Micronesia Climate Change Alliance created web resources, and we uplifted work of other community organizations that are doing work around food sovereignty and food security for our communities. We created a web series called From Our Nanas for Our Nennies, in which we discussed what food security is, how we can all be better stewards of our environment, and how we can be healthier people just by switching up some of our foods, by not consuming so much spam, and by eating more breadfruit, and by eating more things from and for the land. And when we do that, and when we create transportation systems, we can create a more regional circular economy that helps support one another and doesn't divert our precious funds and limited funds as island people to these big corporations that are feeding us foods that are really not good for us in the long term. So having this vision and bold, beautiful vision of having our food systems indigenized and our transportation indigenized can really be bold climate action that could really see a healthier and more prosperous future for our children. And there's so many people who do this sort of work around traditional navigation and around food sovereignty here in Micronesia, and it's really beautiful to witness these sort of solutions from the ground up happening. And that sort of resistance to colonization and dependence also happening. One other project that I'm excited to be working on with Micronesia Climate Change Alliance is the One Canoe project, which is a place-based, culturally rooted K-12 climate literacy curriculum for all the children of the Marianas, in which we take the students at the different age levels and help them navigate using cultural values, using wisdom from traditional navigators, from the master navigators, to help us all navigate and ground to our identities as we move forward such uncertain and precarious times. And these children need to know who they are. We come from highly colonized islands where the military and tourism and other interests come before our own. Economic interests are at the forefront, and not necessarily our cultural perpetuation and our identity as island people and our connection to our ocean and to our lands. So having a curriculum that really reflects those value systems, that really reflects our ancestry, is so important to develop, especially in the face of climate change, because living the ways that we've lived here for thousands of years is the biggest way to ensure that we'll be here for 1,000 more years. And especially in Micronesia, where we have so many islands who are at risk of losing their homelands due to sea level rise, who are at risk of losing coral reefs due to ocean acidification and coral reef loss. And that is the source of our life, the fish that feed off the reef, both the little ones to the small ones to the pelagic fish. If the coral go, we go. And having and ensuring stewardship and environmental, natural information and wisdom, and in passing that on to our children is of utmost importance. And to be able to be a part of a project in which we're creating the curriculum around that is really empowering and really necessary. I also wanted to discuss energy and the use of energy in the Marianas and Guam. So right now, Guam and most of the other island nations are committed by 2045 to be completely powered by renewable energy. And for us here on Guam, for those on Guam, it's really an interesting thing to have that goal, but also seeing our governments not really investing in renewable clean energy. Right now, Guam has a $360 billion contract with a company called KEPCO in Korea that has a very sordid history, has blown up a power plant here on Guam, and they're in the middle of a construction of a new fossil fuel-based power plant that's going to be over 100 megawatts. And so to set these goals but then not act accordingly is something that we as grassroots organizers and we as people on the ground, and most especially the youth, need to be questioning, need to be resisting, and need to be putting pressure on our political leaders to act on and to change, because there's no reason why we should be spending upwards of $1 billion towards building a new renewable or a new fossil fuel based power plant. It's especially if they're saying that it's clean energy, and this is really important too that I want to share. Clean energy doesn't always mean clean. Coal energy is being labeled as clean, and also liquid LNG, liquid nitrified gas, is also being claimed as clean energy, and none of those things are clean. Those sorts of energy, energy sources harm the environment in which they're extracted from, and they are just marketed as clean energy because it's not diesel, it's not pumped from the Middle East, but it is still harming communities throughout Turtle Island or North America. And a lot of the fracking that is occurring, that is running through different pipelines that are being resisted, like Lines 3 and Trans Mountain and those in the Wet'suwet'en lands in Canada and North America, those oils are coming out here to the Pacific and being labeled as clean. So it's really important that we also are very mindful of the savvy ways in which these false solutions are being co-opted and covered up with different words and different ways of thinking about things. It's just marketing tools that we really should be mindful of here in the Pacific. Right now, Micronesia Climate Change Alliance is doing a whole lot of work around energy democracy and sharing what the principles of energy democracy means and what it looks like. I was also on a panel yesterday on false climate solutions and really investigating all the different energy sources and the ways that we need to be moving forward as a whole global community, very watchful of what the different energy sources, especially carbon-based energy sources, do to our communities, and how we need to be moving within principled practices of the just transition. How we need to be ensuring that the historic harms associated with the fossil fuel energy, like racism and slavery and this very extractive system, need to be transformed, and that we need a systems change, not climate change. And this was a really powerful discussion that is taking place across the world. And so Micronesia Climate Change Alliance, if you go to our Instagram page or any of our social media, we're really investigating what energy democracy means and what it could look like for our people, especially in wanting to ensure that we stay below that 1.5 Celsius degree increase in this time. And we also wanted to highlight too in this space the harm of solar farms on our communities, given that we come from Micronesia being small islands. Solar farms are definitely not the way to be moving. I had some photos that I wanted to share. Just in the last few months, we had a pristine ancestral water cave destroyed by a solar farm that failed to do their due diligence to keep their erosion plans in check. So after heavy rains from the rainy season, sludge and gallons and gallons of soil dumped into this ancestral site that was really pristine before. And solar farms take up large swaths of land when land is such a precious commodity and we have all these concrete roofs. We really need to have distributed renewable energy. And as we saw in Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, solar farms are also not very resilient against storms. So to invest our time, money, and resources into solar farms, which really just concentrate the energy grid, it's definitely not the climate solution that we need in this time. I feel like I'm going a little bit long, so I'd like to go ahead and wait for any questions and pass the mic along, and I'm excited to hear and listen to what else is being shared and being done in the Pacific. But that's it from mostly my islands and Micronesia. Thank you.
No, thank you, Moñeka, for that wonderful thought, the expression, the chant. You mentioned it very well, the Pacific navigators and the understanding into the environment. And I really like the chant, Moñeka. It reflects, as you've mentioned it very well, the role of women on institutionalizing climate actions. And there was a phase that you mentioned, even though it is slow, when you were referring to the navigators, even though it was slow, but it was the sustainable way of recognizing the environment, recognizing the key issues that we were trying to really discuss today on clean energy and transport. Yeah, and I also I will not reiterate everything that you mentioned because you really touch on those elements. I'll just highlight on some other areas. A government investment, you mentioned on government investment on renewable energy, and also at the later part you mentioned a clear definition need to be seen with regards to clean energy. When we say definition, a clear Pacific definition of clean energy, because our definition might not be the same as definition of those who are coming into our country. So this, I guess, needs to be cleared out. Thank you so much. And now for question and answer, thank you. Keep on the questions on the chat box. We'll spend time at the end whereby the panelists will answer to the questions that I see coming up on the chat group. Let's move on now. Let us move on to the next speaker, who is none other than Reverend James Bhagwan, who is the General Secretary for the Pacific Conference of Churches, with about 32 member churches and 10 national councils of churches across the 18 Pacific Island states and territories, accounting for about 80% of the Pacific human population. He's an ordained minister for the Methodist Church of Fiji, licensed to preach and also celebrate sacraments in the Anglican Church as well. I'm married to Malin Pickering Bhagwan with 2 children. Without further ado, I will now give and hand over the floor to Reverend James Bhagwan. Thank you so much.
Vinaka Akuila and Bulavinaka, and greetings to you all over the Pacific and around the world where you are joining us. I want to thank Moñeka for leading us in this talanoa, and also for the chant and connecting us with the spirit of our ancestors. And I acknowledge the ancestors, descendants, past, present, and future of our blue Pacific continent, and of the lands and seas of wherever you may be joining us. We are gathered virtually, but we are gathered on land, maybe on sea, that belongs to communities. And I also want to acknowledge the mana of our young people. And that's why we are here today in this pre-COP gathering, because we acknowledge your strength and your power to shape the discourse and the movement for climate justice. Seeing Eva Nancy here, I also want to acknowledge the traditional voyagers that are not only doing this work very importantly, but also joining us in this session. We have Eva. We also, I recognize Teddy Fong, the president of the Utunialo Trust, Alisi, a voyager, and a number of other voyagers who are here to listen and hopefully to share in the chat and in the questions. So we are a region that can, I believe, show the way that we can not only survive the climate crisis, but that we can flourish by changing the way the world lives and moves. At the outset, let me thank the government of Marshall Islands and Solomon Islands, who in March this year put the call out to the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, for a levy, a greenhouse gas levy of $100 a ton, as a way to reduce the carbon emissions in the ocean. A lot of the conversation around climate change and carbon emissions, and I'm sure Taholo can share on that, also is about the carbon emissions into the atmosphere. We're not looking at the impact in the oceans as much as we should, although there has been a lot of work to bring in the ocean into the climate change conversation. And I'm sure that my sister, Eva Nancy, and even Brother Taholo will talk more on traditional voyaging and sustainable low carbon transport from their experiences and their policy work. But I would like to touch on the shift that we need to see in both clean energy and the transportation or the conversion to ecologically intentional living. And, I can see the connections with what Moñeka has shared today. In terms of clean energy, right? We have the sun, we have the wind, we have the ocean for energy, for power. And when we start to focus on what is available locally and what is provided naturally, we start to shift the power dynamics around the energy conversation, because there's a lot of money involved. Energy is business. Let's remember that. And the argument about in favor of fossil fuel and against the transition to clean energy often revolves around jobs, around industries, around employment and economics. But, we need to recognize that in transitioning to clean energy, in transitioning to green energy, to new ways, these can create huge industries. And all entrepreneurs that have become successful in the course of the industrial world take the risks at the beginning. So our argument is that you can take those risks, you can make that investment in the transitions that need to take place. People can be transitioned in work. We can have education focusing on the development sector in terms of clean energy. And so this is an argument that I feel a lot of the carbon or the fossil fuel producing and using countries tend to neglect. There's a lot of talk also in terms of energy around carbon trading. This is also something that we need to keep in mind when we talk about clean energy or how we transition, that a lot of countries are now looking to see how they can buy carbon credits. And we have to remember that that is a mitigation action, not solving the problem. And the problem at the end of the day is our dependence as a planet or as a human population on fossil fuel. And we need to address that dependency on fossil fuel. Monica has touched on already, and I can see in the chat conversations already happening about what is green energy or what is clean energy. And we also need to think about how we not only transition in terms of energy that reduces our carbon emissions, but also in protecting the biodiversity that exists in our community. So already in terms of fossil fuel, while we're thinking about the emissions from fossil fuels, we're also needing to think about the impact on the biodiversity in the communities in which that fossil fuel is being extracted from the sea, from the land. So even when we move into clean energy conversations, we need to remember that as well. Where we build our dams for hydroelectricity, what will that do to the biodiversity of that valley or that forest? Where we place our wind farms, our solar farms, we need to pay attention to the ecosystem in every aspect of development. I think a lot of the countries that try to give us aid in terms of climate adaptation and mitigation maybe also need to support us in our region's shift to clean energy. And this takes me to my final point on intentionality. Our intentionality around our use of energy and how we live with a lighter, more gentle footprint on the earth and the sea. We are always reminded by indigenous communities to walk gently, to tread lightly on the land because the land is sacred, and move lightly on the ocean because the ocean is sacred. And so this means not just replacing energy, so not just replacing and shifting from fossil fuel energy to clean energy, but our dependency on this energy and how we use this energy. And that requires a major shift in our way of living, from focusing on convenience and comfort, the now, for the sake of the future. And there's going to be a lot of hard decisions that your generation will have to make now, not in the future, but now, about how we live. Monica has talked about time, our understanding of time, and Eva can speak to this, being a seasoned traditional voyager, that traditional sailing requires slowing down. And so we need to recognize that. How do we reduce our need for energy? How do we slow things down? How do we ensure that the rest of the so-called developed world recognizes our indigenous wisdom as knowledge, as science, our indigenous methods as technology? As I speak, the big trucks are driving up and down outside my house, showing about unsustainable development. And while we're focusing and celebrating that through internet, we're able to reduce our carbon footprint in terms of this gathering and our energy consumption, let's also remember that connectivity, that data, the internet, phones, routers, servers, high-speed internet for our Netflix, all also have a serious, when added up, a serious energy footprint, carbon footprint. What is the cost of the carbon emissions or the carbon footprint of this meeting, for example? What is the carbon cost or the energy cost for your desire to have the latest phone? So we need to think about that. What is the cost in terms of energy of your Instagram post, of your TikTok video? And how do we transition ourselves into living a low carbon lifestyle, a low energy lifestyle? This is something that we really need to consider. And this is perhaps how we shift our focus as people calling for this change around the world. There's been some questions around nuclear energy. As Pacific people, it's not clean. Just look at Fukushima. and the Japanese government's plan to dump the waste from that in our Pacific Ocean. At PCC, the Pacific Conference of Churches, the churches, conservation groups, indigenous communities have been working together to develop what we call the process of reweaving the ecological mat. And I believe that our traditional voyaging societies are the ambassadors, the living, working example of how we can draw from the past to take us safely into the future. And I want to acknowledge the traditional voyages as a good example of how we reweave the narrative of development, of energy, of living. And to perhaps conclude by going to something that Monica said about locally made food and products. We saw how we can do this as a result of COVID-19 when the borders were closed. Let's not rush into importation and increased carbon emissions in the ocean as borders start to open again. Thank you for your time, and God bless you all.
Thank you so much, Reverend James Bhagwan. That was really a great insight. You mentioned it also very well. Not only about we can survive, but we can flourish here in the Pacific. You mentioned on the areas of greenhouse levy and how we should bring in the discussions of ocean while we are discussing about the space, the air. Also the shift, the ecological intentional living that you mentioned very well. You touch also on elements of green entrepreneurs. But one thing that I also admire from your presentation was the intentionality that you mentioned, what we are doing now for the sake of the future, which really you've really articulated that. Moving from voyage, the navigators, I should say, summarizing your session, your discussion this morning was the profound message you mentioned that you are working and your organization is working on reweaving the ecological mat, which is something that you've really attached well in the moving forward of the development. How do we reweave it, knowing the Pacific? How do we reweave the clean energy and transport for that matter? Before we move to the next panelist this morning, I just we're trying to also navigate ourselves into this new platform, and I thank the Reverend James for mentioning, even with regards to technology, even though we're not traveling, but we should also try to analyze how much energy we're using with all the new technologies that are coming up to help us communicate nowadays. We're trying to navigate also in this platform. I've come to realize that the Secretariat had put a message in the chat group that there is a special place where you could put your questions. It is right on the last tab. Just look up there, you will see chat, and then you have polls, and then you have people on the right side, and the last one is Q&A. So if you want to grab your questions and throw it to the Q&A, I've only seen one there, but I saw that majority of one are really putting our questions in the chat group. Let's move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker today is Eva Nancy Vunikura from Bionengau Lomaiviti, has a deep passion on ocean and its preservation, having sailed the world for the last 9 years. Eva is today the most sailed woman on the traditional Vaka, having joined the Hutonialo in 2011 for the Te Mana o Te voyage and moving on to work for the Okeanos Foundation, where she has helped and trained Vaka crews in Vanuatu, Marshall Islands, Kiribati, and Palau. She has a lot of experience, not only in the with the sailing of traditional voyaging, but she's also a lover of rugby and has represented Fiji also in the 15s and 7 side. So over to you, Eva, for your presentation. Sorry, Eva, if you could just unmute yourself. Thanks. Can you just make a test, Eva? No, we still can't hear you from this side. Just on the bottom, you will see a microphone tab there, just beside the video. If you can just tap on that. What I will do, Eva, I will move on to the next panelist, not to pressure you now. So we'll move on to the next panelist, and you can just try popping in and to check on your microphone. That's not a problem. We are voyagers. We'll try to sail around rough seas as well. I'm happy to move on to our next guest speaker while Eva tries to fix the technical problem. Yeah, with us today is Taholo, Mr. Taholo Kami, who is the CEO of the KamiPasifika solution. Taholo is based here in Fiji, Suva, Fiji, and has led organization development coalitions and the various initiatives across the region. Taholo was part of the Fiji COP23 team as special representative for the ocean from 2017 to 2020, where he was responsible for creating dialogue for the oceans within the UNFCCC. He was also spelled for the Fiji PM on the high-level panel for oceans and co-chair of the Pacific Blue Shipping Partnership. He's a senior advisor to the Near-Terro in developing the Pacific program. He is also an advisor to the Blue Prosperity Coalition with vast experiences in different programs, even at in the areas of conservation, sustainable development, high-level policy framework. Without further ado, of course, he is a family man with a wife and two beautiful daughters. Without further ado, he's also very passionate about backyard farming. Without further ado, I'll now give the time to Mr. Taholo for his presentation. Over.
Thank you, Akuila, and thank you all for making the time, also to the organizers. Thank you for putting together such a great event and the invitation to speak. Just want to acknowledge Monica and James have gone before me. And again, I think the inspiration and some of those issues that you've raised are so important on this topic, and engaging on these issues. They're so important for most of us. I'm going to see if I can stick to time and just get really quickly. I've done a lot of work on the policy angle for oceans. A lot of interest in the connection between policy and the reality of who we are as Pacific people and identity. And I think as we engage on these issues of energy, transportation, again, it touches this thing: is there this opportunity to shift from a almost like a Western framework of how we've done things or should do things, and Western efficiencies and effectiveness or descriptions of that, to what would be appropriate and best for us as Pacific people in large ocean spaces and small island countries. And the opportunity to rethink from the basis of where we are. So just first of all, the question, can renewable energy replace fossil fuels? Can Pacific countries be fossil fuel dependent? Yes, we can. The challenge, of course, is how do we shift when many of our countries, even though aspire to be zero by 2050,
human, but also to be part of various cultures.
I'm getting other
and our
voices.
individual intersectional identities. Thanks.
Okay.
Maybe I will throw another two questions before we end this session. With the interest of time, I apologize, I'm not able every question.
Sorry, that's my buddy interpreter. His audio is on. I'm trying to get him to turn it off. Sorry.
Okay. Yep. Just to continue from there very quickly, is just looking at opportunities to make the shift. And not too long ago, energy was the big issues. The early part of the, let's say, 2008, 2009, around the decade ago, it was renewable energy. And I just remember sitting in a SOPAC energy meeting for the region in Tonga and being called into a room where the Tongan energy advisor, or the person in charge, had all the banks, the development banks lined around him, including the World Bank. And he basically said to them, as a Pacific Islander, I want to say to you, why are you all knocking at my door at different times? And he says, we don't have the capacity. There's 3 people in my office, and our policy is 50% renewable energy in 3 years, which of course at the time seemed impossible. But he said, my job is to deliver that. Your job is to help me deliver that. Your job is not to come and run your own projects on bits and pieces of energy production in Tonga. We went through, I was watching and part of this very small group that sat around with the energy coordinator. And basically what he was saying is, our aspiration as a country is 50% renewable. Many of our Pacific countries, by a certain time, many of our Pacific countries have made the zero commitment by 2045, by 2050, but definitely zero by 2050. And the challenge here is, where does the vision come from beyond the statement to make this a reality? And then how do we make that reality apply to our aspirations, and our aspirations in terms of clean, our aspirations in terms of green and blue, biodiversity wins as well, our aspirations in terms of how does this apply properly in our situations. And, even a distributed network, as Moñeka said, not the energy farms that we celebrated as solutions, as quick solutions by donors, and doing this properly. And how do we do this with electricity generation? And then how do we do this with transportation? Transport on island and transport in the ocean. And what this led to was the Tonga Energy Roadmap. And he basically, when the banks and them said, oh, this would be difficult, doesn't fit in our timelines, he said, that's not my problem, that's your problem. Why don't you all get together and you tell Tonga, how do we come together to help you deliver your objective? And suddenly there's this point of clarity. And, over the next 3 to 5 years after that, most of the Pacific countries developed energy roadmaps and developed a common vision, and are now in a stage where they can measure, how much is renewable, what more needs to be done. But still some tough decisions need to be made.
Hello.
Another discussion we had a few years ago is we looked at transportation and realized we were talking transportation and decarbonization in bits and pieces. That it was project driven. Again, it was like energy 5 or 6 years before. Ministerial meetings were endorsing projects, but weren't forcing countries to look again, how do we transition from the shipping, for example, that's so important to our small island countries or large ocean countries? How do we transition from where we are today on old technology, old boats, inefficient boats, and unsafe boats, and also the fact that we've left our traditional skills behind, and how do we transition to a place where we re-engage our people on better transportation, and then we also transform the industry itself to be clean and blue. And we started what we call the Pacific Blue Shipping Partnership. That's 7 countries looking at 40% decarbonization by 2030 and 0 by 2050. The issue here is none of these solutions happen overnight. And none of them, when our leaders announce a 0 by 2050, you're talking about a 15 to 20 year walk. And solutions need to start, and these discussions that we're having today are critical to engage not just the policy frameworks, but also engage the clarity in terms of a vision at a national level and a regional level, and then clarity to donors and supporters. I think we couldn't have these conversations 10 years ago. We couldn't say yes to the question, can renewable energy replace fossil fuels? We can with confidence today. And one of the opportunities here is climate change. And I think we've heard some of these coming through. And the other one is that there's this growing sentiment and a reconnection to our history and our ancestral history in terms of we used to navigate these oceans with confidence. And we need to do the same today. We need a transportation roadmap for land and sea to meet 0 by 2050. Every country needs a transportation roadmap. We need a transition towards solar hybrids. We might need eco-diesel for a while, but a transition towards electric over time. And again, what does that reality look like? And how can we own the approach and own the solutions and not just live on the whatever is affordable from somebody else? And the thing is, with climate change targets, we have that opportunity. The other question is, how can private organizations, Pacific countries move forward? I think private enterprise, as we're seeing around the world, needs to take the lead when governments take their time. And we're seeing shipping companies, while the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, is struggling to be ambitious. Their target is 50% by 2050, with a huge push led by Marshall Islands and Pacific countries, a huge push to be for more ambition. We're seeing some of the biggest shipping companies in the world, like Maersk, etc., already declare 0 by 2050 because they know the market is starting to demand it. Certain companies are saying, what is the footprint of your boat that takes our goods from one country to another? What does that look like? And it's making sense to private companies while it's not making sense to our politicians. And so when we look at the role of private sector, you look at bus companies, you look at the shipping companies today, you look at others that are having to live on expensive electricity or need to bypass the inefficient electricity system with their own generators, and these companies need to start stepping up and leading the way by committing to zero carbon even sooner than 2050, and forcing the turnaround by our politicians, because politicians, unfortunately, listen more to the private sector than they do to those doing the sort of things that we all do. And private sector has a loud voice in this. Private sector has to start to look at taking the lead, not only because it makes sense, but it also makes sound business sense. Not just sense to environment and sense on climate change, but it makes sound business sense in the long run. And you'll find the bus companies will probably move faster than government if the incentives are not there. On the issue of what can we do as a community level, I think much of that was covered by James before me. But the whole issue of lobbying for government leadership, lobbying for incentives to happen to speed up these commitments from private sector and from others. At the moment, there's a lack of practical alternatives in terms of public transport, but advocacy, taking those first steps individually in terms of treading lighter with our options, it forces decision makers to start to look at these things about how do we make it better for more cyclists to be on the road, for more people to be using transport that's more viable. How do you tax, for example, the heavy duty, the bigger users of fossil fuels, so that options for hybrids and other vehicles start to become more viable. And we're seeing a mix of options being presented by governments. And again, this is where communities and individuals can do a lot more. Another one is how do you challenge a circle of friends to be doing more together? And I think there's this opportunity to move forward. On mentoring, the invitation you see from James, I've always tried to keep a group of young people close in terms of not just as friends, but as long-term people that we walk together. With the acknowledgement from my side is that these are the people that will step up in the future and continue the work and continue to do much better, I hope, than people of my generation. Just to conclude on this, is just 2 points here is, one, our Pacific countries must take charge and own the vision. And this is aligning internally the policy and bureaucracy, that we don't have a politician saying something and ministries taking forever to take action on it. The whole challenge of bringing people on board and ensuring that it's not just viable, but it's politically viable, and it's politically unviable not to support it. And then the whole thing of aligning our budgets with donors and other financing. And you'll find that often we'll find that the donors are doing certain things, but then even our budgets still reflect the economy of the past and not the aspirations of the new economy that our rhetoric that our rhetoric is quite positive, but what we do with our budget remains negative. The second part here is climate targets is an opportunity for a better economy, but they demand transformation. You cannot do 40% by 2030 without rethinking your whole shipping infrastructure. And but it opens a whole new opportunity because of climate targets. The whole refinancing of shipping and the transformation of our domestic shipping is possible. It would be impossible to have this discussion 5 years ago. But by being ambitious with climate, we suddenly can talk about redesigning and renewing the fleet. When we've depended in the last 40 to 50 years in most of our countries on when a donor decides to give us a new boat or our company buys a old 25-year-old boat. And so these new options suddenly come alive. When we're here in Suva, we can, instead of thinking of how do we improve the highways and how do we drop the price on hybrid vehicles or eventually electric vehicles, on our Nausori corridor, which is more crowded, we suddenly can sort of think about, can we finance rail from Nausori to Suva? And that possibility becomes even more viable because of a climate target. And it's an opportunity to rethink issues that were difficult 5 to 10 years ago. We can't hit the climate targets without transformation. Our biggest challenge is managing the transition and ensuring that the things that are important to us in terms of our values and how we determine issues like what is clean, what aligns with our values and culture, what aligns with the kind of lifestyles we want to live in this transformation. I think the important time is now in starting to determine how those decisions are made. We can't live with a rubber stamp option that's put on us because it's cheap and because someone is willing to give it to us. I think it's important that the engagement and the discussions involve the voices on this group, on this panel, and the voices of the people now, and that we demand it. if we want to see the transformation become the solution that we all aspire to. Finally, with financing, it makes sense to donors if our vision is clear. It makes sense in terms of climate funding coming into the energy and renewable and the transportation sector, if our vision is clear. And suddenly we're talking something that could be hundreds of millions of dollars as a possibility, when in the past could not be part of this discussion. And that's possible because climate financing and climate targets have changed or shifted the financing game. I'm going to stop there. I think there'll be a lot more interesting issues being brought by the questions and further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Taholo. Understanding your experience and background, you've really touched on elements of policies. I will not go through everything that you've mentioned, but you mentioned key areas of roadmap. First of all is on lobbying and advocacy, and from that how we could have a good picture into moving it into roadmap, and then from the roadmap how could we from there have commitments been done by key stakeholders. And you've also mentioned areas of partnership, government, politicians, private sectors, and other areas of partnership, which you've highlighted very well this morning. I will not take too much of the time. We are really running out of time. You might have seen the Secretariat putting a message on the chat box. I've kindly requested even if Eva could just present, because I know she's really excited to present to us this morning. So without further ado, I give the time now to Eva. Over to you, Eva.
Vinaka, Akuila, can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Vinaka, sorry about that. I'll jump in straight to my talanoa. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge two great navigators that has left us. One is Papa Mau Pialung from Satawal in the Federate States of Micronesia. I was honored to visit his place and even visit his resting place. And secondly, to my late skipper, Jonathan Smith, that just left us a couple of weeks ago. It's said that we've lost somebody that advocates about sustainable sea transportation and climate change. And I was honored to say farewell to him out in the ocean. May their souls rest in peace. Thank you for inviting me to talk on clean energy and transport through this Drua experience and its flagship. The SV Wolasingavo translates as the new rising star. It's the morning star. If you wake up in the morning, it rises up in the morning. And that's what the Wolasingavo that means. The Drua experience was born out of the vision and passion of developing sustainable sea transport solutions for the Pacific and revitalizing traditional Pacific seafaring culture. It is an environmentally and economically sustainable business with a zero carbon footprint, servicing Fiji's tourism, education, and cultural heritage and training needs. The sustainable sea transport vision has two key pillars. One is to tackle the high cost of fuel and fuel consumption by inter-island shipping. And two is to showcase that traditional navigation, if revitalized, will provide clean energy and solution to deal with one. These two pillars are target climate change mitigation. The Drua Iwolasingavo and Utunialo and the fleet of Wakamotus and the Wakamoanas throughout the Pacific, many of which I have had the pleasure of sailing on, are a testament that Pillar 2 is possible. However, the lack of support and investment in low carbon, energy efficient technology for inter-island shipping, and the lack of funding available to deal with the low cost of knowledge, skills, and practice of traditional seafaring continues to be the challenge for us. I have seen at conferences who use images of these traditional canoes as their backgrounds or on virtual conferences on reports. But unfortunately, these do not translate to actual support. If we are serious about tackling the issues of if we are not serious about tackling the issues of clean energy and transport as mitigation for climate change, then just like our sinking island, the time to act is now. Naka, I have some answers to the question that were asked, like how can renewable energy replace fossil fuel? Yes, it can. We can replace that. It can be accomplished, and I have proven it by sailing so many miles on ocean by using only wind and solar. The Utuniyalo in 2015, in partnership with Wellington Chocolate Factory, delivered 1 ton of cocoa over to Aotearoa, New Zealand, to Wellington, using no fossil fuels. And to go to the second question, I know we are running out of time, but I'd love to. I'm not a very sorry if I'm talking fast, Inise. I'm sorry. For what can we do at community level to support more transition to clean energy and transport? Yes, we can do that. Like we can go out with more education. Like for Drua experience in Utunyalo, we have it here in Fiji. And if we can look for sponsors, they can utilize us to go out to the communities and to advocate to the communities, to the people of how our ocean means to us, to you and I. And we can go from there. Just to share a bit on what I was doing for the past 9 years, thanks to the people that have shared their knowledge to me. And I have so many people to mention, but thank you to the Pacific people of the ocean. It's time to act now. It's more for action than talking. Maybe if we put our act together, then we can keep moving forward.
Thank you so much, Eva. And that was a good way to also summarize your presentation. And not only that, but also you've answered the questions that are up there in the chat box. That's also good. And your closing remark, which is very a good way to end this voyage, also in your presentation. We do not have enough time. So what I will do is, panelists, please very briefly and just short. You've gone through the chat group. You've seen the questions there. I'll just give you time just to answer just some few questions and then your closing remark. We'll start from Moñeka and then we'll follow that order again. Yeah, over to you, Moñeka. Just very brief. Thanks.
Sorry. Yes, I wanted to answer the question on nuclear energy that was in the chat. Yes, a lot of other climate activists outside the Pacific are supporting nuclear energy, but if you speak with indigenous communities across Turtle Island, where a lot of these resources are extracted, like in New Mexico, where they have uranium, these communities are severely harmed. And it's also really important to think about also renewable energies, like and the ways that in which the resources for the building of that innovation, like lithium, and the relationship to the communities where these minerals and important metals are found. So really, even though renewable energies is a solution, ensuring that the planet and that the people come before profit is still going to be of utmost importance for all of us. And that is the way that we need to be building forward and ensuring peace and ensuring prosperity for all peoples, not just profit for some. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Moñeka, for those your answering of the question, and also Kami, very strong closer to your presentation today. We'll now move on to Reverend James Bhagwan. Over to you. Sorry, maybe we can come back to Reverend James after this. Can we move to Mr. Taholo if there are any questions specifically you would want to answer, and then just your closing remark. Over.
I just appreciate what's been shared already by the fellow colleagues, presenters on this call, and just encourage further action from here moving forward. But thank you very much, Malo Apito.
Thank you so much, Mr. Taholo. Reverend James, do you want to ponder on some of the questions that we have here on the chat box? Just maybe like brief summary of some answers to the question and your closing remark, please. But I've also seen Reverend James had also answered some of the question in the chat box, and also trying to see that some of the questions are answered today. I'm sorry that we have to bring this session to a close. Participants, we do apologize that we started late. But again, as all the presented had mentioned, we are voyagers. Once we start sailing, it seems like we can't stop sailing. We want to carry on sailing once we see that we understand the waters. We now know how to navigate. But thank you so much, Reverend James. It's okay. His connection is playing up, and I see also participants also thanking the panelists. It was a fantastic. It was a wonderful way to discuss this, to kickstart. This session is an icebreaker. It will lead up to more discussions in different sessions, which will then close tomorrow. All your questions and all the comments in the chat box, I've asked the technical team to save it, because then we will craft the 5 areas from this session, which will then build up to the outcome document of this whole event, as our roadmap, our sailing towards COP26 come end of the year. Nothing else from my side, but thank you very much. A big Pacific thank you very much to each and every one of you. You have a blessed day, and please keep safe. And of course, join the rest of the session. Now the workshop is also open, so you can move into the workshop area that you would want to go into. Again, thank you so much, and goodbye for now.